They auctioned the mountain woman for being too wild. Men laughed, coins clinked on the dusty courthouse steps, and the sheriff's hammer fell with a crack that echoed like a gunshot through the cold morning air. But then a scarred mountain man, a ghost from the high peaks, stepped out of the crowd. He slapped $2 on the railing, his voice quiet but hard as granite. And then he did the unthinkable. He didn't buy her to own her. He didn't buy her for work or for pleasure. He bought her to set her free. The crowd went dead silent. The only sound was the wind whispering through the pines and the distant toll of the church bell, as if marking a funeral. In that one moment, everything changed. Because this woman wasn't just some outcast. She carried a secret, a piece of paper in a beaded pouch that could bring the mighty railroad to its knees. A secret men were willing to kill for, and the killing was about to start. Autumn leaves skittered across the main street of Silver Creek, Colorado. The year was 1878. The town was buzzing, but not with the usual talk of gold veins and saloon fights. Today was a spectacle. The whole town, from dirt-crusted miners to their Sunday-best wives, had gathered to see a woman sold. Amanda Greyhawk stood on those steps, her back as straight as a lodgepole pine. The cold wind whipped at her rawhide dress, the intricate beadwork shimmering in the pale sun. Her dark braids, woven with leather strips in the Apache way, fell past her shoulders. But it was her eyes that held them. Green as a mountain meadow after a storm, a legacy from her Scottish father, and right now they blazed with a fire that could melt steel. Sheriff Tom Weller cleared his throat, enjoying the attention. By order of this court, his voice scraped the air, Amanda Greyhawk, being deemed unfit for decent living, is to be sold as a wife to any man willing to take responsibility for her wild ways. He spat the word wild like it was poison, and a ripple of cruel laughter went through the crowd. Ain't worth the trouble, a miner shouted, his face a mask of grime and greed. That one's got more Apache than sense in her. Amanda's fingers curled into fists. The leather ties on her wrists bit deep into her skin, but her face remained a stone carving of defiance. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. 2 bits, another man yelled, tossing a pair of coins that landed with a metallic ping at her feet. The sound made her stomach clench. 4 bits! A whole $1 if she comes with that fancy dress. The laughter grew louder, uglier. Sheriff Weller was getting impatient. The joke was wearing thin, and the sun was climbing higher, making him sweat under his collar. Come now, gentlemen. Surely someone sees the value in a strong back and a... His words were cut short. The crowd parted like water around a boulder. A tall figure pushed through, his movements fluid and silent, like a mountain lion. Amanda's eyes narrowed. He wore buckskins, worn smooth with use. A powder horn was slung at his hip, a well-oiled rifle across his back. His face was all harsh angles and weathered skin, dominated by a long, pale scar that ran from his left temple straight down to his jaw. But it was his eyes that stopped her breath. They were the color of a winter sky, clear and sharp, and holding a strange kindness she hadn't seen in a man's face for a very long time. She'd heard the whispers. Kevin Boone, the reclusive trapper who came down from the high country maybe twice a year, traded his furs for salt and ammunition, and vanished back into the peaks without a word to anyone. They said he was half wild himself. They said he'd fought off 3 claim jumpers with nothing but a skinning knife. They said a sickness had taken his wife years ago, and a part of him had died with her. He didn't look at the sheriff. He looked at Amanda. Then he spoke, and his voice, though quiet, cut through the noise like a razor. $2. He pulled 2 heavy silver dollars from a leather pouch. They flashed in the morning sun as he held them up. The crowd went utterly still. You could have heard a pine needle drop. Sheriff Weller's eyebrows shot up. 2s for the half-breed girl? He scanned the faces in the crowd, looking for another bid, a joke, anything. But no one spoke. The mountain man's gaze was a heavy weight on them all. Weller shrugged, a flicker of annoyance on his face. He lifted his gavel. "Sold! To Kevin Boone for 2 eyes!" The crowd surged forward, a wave of morbid curiosity. What would the silent mountain man do with his new property? Amanda tensed, her body coiling like a spring, ready for a fight, ready for anything. But Kevin Boone wasn't like any man she had ever known. He climbed the steps, his boots making hollow thuds on the wooden planks. He stopped in front of her, his winter sky eyes looking straight into hers. Without a word, he drew a long, sharp knife from the sheath on his belt. Amanda held her breath, bracing for the cold steel. Instead, he reached behind her. With one swift, clean motion, he sliced through the leather bonds at her wrists. The ropes fell away. He stepped back and raised his voice so every person in that square could hear him. "No human being should ever be bought or sold," he declared, the words ringing with an authority that had nothing to do with the law. "You're free to go, Miss Greyhawk." A collective gasp went through the crowd. It was a sound of shock, of disbelief. The sheriff's face turned a blotchy red, his jowls quivering with rage. "Now see here, Boone, the sale is complete." "It is," Kevin interrupted, his tone leaving no room for argument, "and I've chosen to set her free. Unless you're suggesting the law doesn't recognize my right to do with my property as I see fit?" Weller's mouth opened and closed like a fish on a hook. He was trapped by his own corrupt rules. He spat a wad of tobacco juice into the dust. "Your $2. Your choice. But don't come crying to me when she shows her true nature." Amanda rubbed her raw wrists, the feeling slowly returning to her fingers. She studied Kevin's scarred face, searching for the trick, the hidden price. There was always a price. But she saw no mockery in his gaze, no lie hiding in the corners of his eyes, just a quiet, unshakable conviction. "Why?" she asked, the single word hoarse. "Because it's right," he answered, as if it were the simplest thing in the world. The crowd began to break apart, muttering and whispering. Some glared at Amanda and Kevin with suspicion. Others looked thoughtful, a seed of doubt planted in their minds about the kind of town they were living in. As the sun began to dip toward the western peaks, Amanda found herself following Kevin away from the now empty square. She kept her distance, a lifetime of caution making her wary. "I don't need your protection," she said, her voice sharp with pride. Kevin stopped and turned. "Never thought you did," he said. "But sometimes even the strongest need a moment's grace to find their footing." He stood with his hands in plain sight, giving her space. The setting sun caught the silver in his dark hair, and for a fleeting moment she was reminded of her father, another man who believed in doing what was right, no matter the cost. "I'm much obliged," she said, the formal words feeling strange on her tongue. "But don't expect me to play the grateful savage." A ghost of a smile touched Kevin's scarred face. "Expect nothing except what you choose to be, Miss Greyhawk. That's what freedom means." He turned and walked away, his silhouette framed against the blazing sunset. Amanda watched him go, feeling something inside her shift, like ice on a river beginning to break up after a long, hard winter. The courthouse bell tolled the evening hour, the sound rolling over a town that had just witnessed something it didn't understand. Amanda stood alone in the growing darkness, the feeling of unbound wrists a strange and precious thing. She knew what the town didn't. She knew why Sheriff Weller had been so eager to see her sold, broken, and powerless. Because in the beaded pouch at her waist lay a folded piece of paper. A deed. Her father's last will and testament, granting her sole ownership of the one thing the railroad company wanted more than gold. The timber stands and the deep, cold water springs of the high country. And she knew that Kevin Boone's $2 act of mercy hadn't ended her troubles. It had just fired the first shot in a war. The next morning dawned crisp and cold. Amanda had spent the night in the loft of the livery stable, hidden among the scent of hay and horses. Kevin had insisted, knowing that a lone woman, especially one branded wild, was not safe in the town's boarding houses. Golden shafts of sunlight pierced the gaps in the wooden walls, illuminating dancing dust motes. She sat up, brushing straw from her hair, when the stable door creaked open below. She tensed, her hand instinctively going to the small knife she kept hidden in her boot. "Miss Greyhawk?" Kevin's voice was soft. "Brought you some coffee and bread." She peered down through the opening in the loft floor. He stood there, holding a steaming tin cup and a cloth-wrapped bundle. His rifle was slung across his back, a permanent part of him, but his stance was open, non-threatening. He set the food and coffee on an overturned barrel and stepped back, giving her space to come down. "Why are you still helping me?" she asked, her voice laced with the suspicion that had kept her alive for years. "Reckon a body needs breakfast?" he said simply, "whether they trust the hand offering it or not." She climbed down the ladder, her moccasins silent on the rungs. The rich aroma of the coffee was a temptation she couldn't resist. But she'd learned the hard way that a man's kindness was often just a baited hook. She remembered other men who had offered food and a warm fire, only to reveal their true, ugly intentions later. She would not be fooled again. "It's just coffee," Kevin said, reading the hesitation in her eyes. "And day-old bread from the baker's. Nothing more." She took the cup, the warmth seeping into her cold fingers. The first sip was strong and black, and it brought a sharp, painful memory of her father, who used to say his coffee was strong enough to wake the dead. The bread was crusty, but it was food, and her stomach ached with emptiness. "Much obliged," she said, keeping her distance as she ate. "Thought we might walk a spell," Kevin suggested. "Town's quieter in the morning, fewer folk to stare." She studied him over the rim of her cup. There was no lie in those winter sky eyes. But what choice did she have, trapped in a town that hated her, with nowhere to go? "Very well," she agreed. They stepped out into the bright morning. As they walked down the main street, heads turned, whispers followed them like a foul wind. "Ought to be ashamed. That wild one. Boone's lost his mind." Amanda kept her chin high, her gaze fixed straight ahead, refusing to acknowledge them. They hadn't gone 50 yards when Sheriff Weller stepped out from an alleyway blocking their path. His badge glinted in the sun as he hooked his thumbs in his gun belt, a smug look on his face. "Well now," he drawled, "if it ain't the mountain man and his savage pet. Seems to me you're interfering in lawful matters, Boone. That girl was declared unfit for decent society." Kevin shifted slightly, placing his body between Amanda and the sheriff. "The sale was legal, Tom, and I set her free. That's legal, too." "Is that so?" Weller's hand drifted down, resting casually on the butt of his revolver. "And what's to stop me from declaring her a vagrant right now? She's got no home, no kin, no visible means of support." "I am her visible means of support," Kevin said, his voice hard. "She's under my protection." Amanda bristled. She didn't need any man's protection, but she understood the game being played. She would not stand by silently while two men decided her fate. Not again. She reached into the beaded pouch at her waist. Her fingers closed around the folded, wax-sealed paper. "I have means enough," she declared, her voice ringing with a strength that made both men turn to look at her. She held the document high. "This is my father's deed. It grants me claim to the timber stands and the 3 springs in the high country. Signed by Alexander Greyhawk, witnessed and sealed by the territorial judge himself." Kevin's head snapped around, pure shock on his face. He had freed her out of principle, never suspecting she was anything more than a persecuted outcast. But it was Weller's reaction that was more telling. The smugness vanished from his face, replaced by a flash of greedy, naked interest. His eyes narrowed. "Is that so?" the sheriff said, his voice suddenly slick as oil. Mighty valuable property up there, especially with the railroad pushing through. Which is why I need to reach my father's cabin, Amanda said, pressing her advantage. The deed is no good unless I'm living on the property, as the law requires. Understanding dawned in Kevin's eyes. That's why they did it, he said, the pieces clicking into place. That's why they had you declared unfit, to void the deed. Amanda nodded grimly. My father knew they would try something. He made sure everything was legal before he died. Weller's face darkened. This wasn't going according to his plan. Now, see here. We're leaving, Kevin cut him off, his voice like iron. Unless you want to explain to the territorial judge why you're interfering with a legal property owner on her way to claim her inheritance. The sheriff's hand tightened on his gun, his knuckles white. For a moment, Amanda thought he would draw. But the threat of the judge, a man whose authority outranked his, was too great. He stepped aside, his face contorted with rage. Your funeral, Boone, he spat. That one is nothing but trouble. They walked on, leaving the fuming sheriff behind them. As soon as they were out of earshot, Kevin spoke, his voice low. You should have told me about the deed. I don't know you, Amanda replied simply. Kevin nodded, accepting the truth in her words. Fair enough. But that deed changes everything. It doesn't make you free. It makes you a target. Railroad men don't play gentle when there's this much money involved. I know. Amanda's voice was heavy with a weariness beyond her years. But it's all I have left of him. His land. His dream. They reached the general store. Kevin began gathering supplies, coffee, beans, salt pork, and boxes of ammunition. Lots of ammunition. The storekeeper kept casting nervous glances her way, his hands trembling as he packed their goods. You'll need a mule, Kevin said as they stepped back onto the street. Can't carry enough for a mountain winter on foot, and the trail to your father's land is too rough for a wagon. I have no money, Amanda admitted, the words tasting like ash. I do, Kevin said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Consider it a loan. You can pay me back once your claim is secured. By the time the sun began to touch the western peaks, they were ready. A sturdy mule was laden with supplies. Amanda, now dressed in practical wool pants and a warm jacket, sat atop her father's old mare, which Kevin had retrieved from the livery. They rode out of Silver Creek as the first lamps were being lit, not looking back. They made camp that night in a hidden hollow, the small fire a bubble of warmth in the vast, cold darkness. As they ate a simple meal of beans and bread, the silence between them was thick with unspoken questions. Your father, Kevin said finally, staring into the flames. He taught you the mountain ways. Some, Amanda said. My mother's people taught me more, before they were driven north. She fell silent, the old pain a tight knot in her chest. Kevin didn't press. He could see the shadows in her eyes. He knew loss. He knew the kind of wounds that never fully healed. But as he took the first watch, his rifle across his knees, he realized the truth. He hadn't just bought a woman's freedom for $2. He had bought himself a war with the railroad, and this woman, with her fierce green eyes and her father's deed, was the prize. He looked over at her, wrapped in her blanket, her face serene in the firelight. Something about her quiet strength called to a part of him he thought had been buried with his wife, a protective instinct, fierce and unyielding. He didn't know then that this quiet woman would soon heal a dying child, enraging the very people whose acceptance she needed. He didn't know that in a matter of days, hired guns would come for them in the night, with fire and bullets. And he didn't know that the scar on his face was nothing compared to the secrets he carried in his own past, secrets that tied him to the very railroad they were about to fight. The next dawn painted the sky in pale shades of pink and gold. They broke camp quickly, moving with the quiet efficiency of people who understood that the wilderness did not forgive mistakes. The trail ahead was a rough wagon path that soon dwindled to a narrow track climbing steadily into the high country. Amanda rode with an easy grace, her eyes constantly scanning, not just for danger, but for the land's hidden gifts. She slid from her horse to gather a cluster of purple coneflowers. "Good medicine," she explained, her voice low. "For fever, and for wounds." Kevin watched as she tucked them carefully into a saddlebag, murmuring a quiet thanks in Apache. She was a part of this land, he realized, not just living on it, but living with it. She moved with a purpose that reminded him of the mountain cats he sometimes tracked, self-contained and perfectly in tune with her surroundings. "My wife used to gather herbs," he found himself saying, the words surprising him. He rarely spoke of Sarah, though she preferred garden plants, said the wild ones were too stubborn. Amanda mounted her horse again. "The wild ones are stronger," she replied, her gaze distant. "They have to fight to survive." Kevin knew she wasn't just talking about plants. By midday, they reached a high ridge. Kevin pulled his horse to a halt, gesturing for Amanda to do the same. Below them, the valley floor was crawling with men, dozens of them swarming like ants, driving stakes into the ground, the sharp ring of hammers echoing up the mountainside. "Railroad crews," Kevin said, his voice grim. "They're moving faster than I expected." Amanda's back went rigid. Her knuckles were white where she gripped the reins. "They're on my father's land," she said, her voice tight with a cold fury. "Those stakes. They're marking a route straight through the spring meadow." "We'll have to circle wide," Kevin said, his eyes on her face. "We can't risk them seeing us. Not with that deed you're carrying." She gave a sharp nod, but her eyes lingered on the scar the men were carving into the landscape. "My father used to say the railroad was a great iron snake," she murmured, "swallowing everything in its path. He wanted this land to stay free." They turned east, into the dense pine forest where the surveyors wouldn't go. The journey was slower, the path obscured by thick undergrowth, but it was safer. Kevin led them along hidden game trails he knew from his years of trapping, navigating by the sun and the shape of the distant peaks. The air grew thinner, sharper. The scent of pine and the promise of snow were all around them. Finally, as the sun began to bleed across the western sky, he guided them around a massive outcropping of rock. And there it was. A small cabin, nestled against the stone, solid and secure. A clear stream tumbled past its door, the sound a constant, gentle music. Smoke-blackened logs told of years of warmth, and neat stacks of firewood promised comfort against the coming winter. "It's not much," Kevin said, his voice suddenly gruff, as if he were embarrassed by its humility. "But it's dry and warm." Amanda surveyed the scene. "Good water," she noted. "Good protection from the wind. It's a smart place for a home." As they unloaded the mule, Kevin pointed out the cabin's features. "Creek never runs dry. There's a small cave back in the rocks, makes a good root cellar, plenty of game." The inside was simple. A stone fireplace dominated one wall. Rough-hewn shelves held jars of dried beans and flour. A narrow bed stood in one corner. "You take the bed," Kevin said immediately. "I'll sleep by the fire." Amanda started to protest, but he cut her off. "You're tired, even if you won't admit it," he said, his tone gentle but firm. "My word, you'll be safe here." She looked at him for a long moment, then gave a small nod. As he built up the fire, the simple domestic act seemed to loosen a knot of tension in her shoulders. The warmth of the small cabin began to seep into her bones, a feeling of safety she hadn't realized she'd been missing so desperately. They ate a simple supper of cornbread and beans. The last light faded from the single window, and the fire cast dancing shadows on the walls. In the flickering light, Amanda's reserve began to melt away. "My father used to sing," she said unexpectedly, her voice soft. "Old songs from his home in Scotland. He said music helped a man feel less alone in these mountains." Kevin nodded, understanding the profound loneliness of the high peaks. I know some psalms, he offered. Nothing fancy, but they help on the long nights. He began to sing, his voice rough but true. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. The ancient words filled the small cabin. Amanda listened, her face thoughtful. He could see the conflict in her, the deep-seated caution warring with a desire to trust. When he finished, she was silent for a time. My mother's people had their own songs to the Creator, she said finally. Different words, same spirit. She touched the medicine pouch at her neck. Sometimes I don't know which prayers to trust. Reckon the Creator hears them all, Kevin said simply. She unrolled her bedding near the hearth, choosing a spot where she could see both the door and the window, her father's deed tucked safely beneath her makeshift pillow. Kevin banked the fire for the night and settled into his own blankets across the room, giving her a wide berth. Outside, the wind sighed through the pines. The creek whispered its endless song, and for the first time in a very long time, Amanda slept without one eye open. She didn't know that their fragile peace was about to be shattered. She didn't know that a desperate mother was already riding toward them, carrying a terror worse than the railroad, a fever that was burning her young son alive. And Amanda, in an act of mercy, was about to make the biggest mistake of her life. She was about to show them her power. And in doing so, she would give her enemies the very weapon they needed to destroy her. They fell into a quiet rhythm in the days that followed. Amanda rose before dawn, her hands as skilled with an axe as they were with herbs. She replenished the woodpile while Kevin tended to the mule, the two of them working in a comfortable silence that needed no words. She explored the woods around the cabin, her sharp eyes spotting the hidden medicines of the forest. Yarrow for staunching blood, wild mint for soothing stomachs. She moved with a reverence that Kevin found himself admiring, always leaving more than she took. One afternoon, she caught 2 fat trout from the stream, using nothing but a horsehair line and a carved bone hook. My mother's people taught me, she said, cleaning the fish with swift, practiced strokes. You must respect the spirits of the river if you wish to eat. Kevin was about to reply when the sound of frantic hoofbeats echoed up the trail. They both tensed, reaching for their weapons, but it was a woman's voice that cried out, "Mr. Boone! Mr. Boone, are you there?" Martha Callahan burst into the clearing, her face pale with terror. She nearly fell from her horse in her haste. "It's Tommy!" she gasped, her words tumbling out. "It's my boy!" "The fever's taken him. Something awful. Dr. Warren's been with him for 2 days, but nothing helps. He's burning up, Mr. Boone. He's dying." Kevin saw Amanda's face change. The wary survivor was gone, replaced by the healer. "Amanda," he said quietly, "you know fever medicines." She hesitated, her eyes flickering from Kevin to the desperate mother. To reveal her knowledge was to make herself a target. It was to confirm every dark whisper about her wild ways. "Please," Martha Callahan whispered, her eyes filling with tears. "He's only 8 years old." That was all it took. Amanda's expression softened. Without another word, she went to the cabin and returned with her medicine pouch and the herbs she had gathered. They rode hard, following Martha down the mountain. The Callahan homestead was a small, neat cabin in a lower valley. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of sickness. The boy, Tommy, was thrashing on the bed, his skin a terrifying, fiery red. Dr. Warren, the town's physician, sat slumped in a chair, his face a mask of weary defeat. Amanda moved to the boy's bedside with a quiet authority that commanded the room. She felt his pulse, listened to his ragged breathing. Then she began to work. She crushed fresh herbs into a poultice, steeped dried leaves in hot water, her movements swift and sure. "Clean cloths," she ordered, and Martha hurried to obey. "More water," she said to Kevin, and he was out the door with the bucket before she finished the sentence. Through the long night, she fought for the boy's life. She bathed his hot skin, placed the cooling poultice on his chest, and spooned the bitter herb tea between his cracked lips. All the while, she hummed a low, ancient Apache chant, a sound that seemed to calm the boy's restless delirium. Kevin stood guard at the door. Word had spread like wildfire. The half-breed woman was working her magic on the Callahan boy. Neighbors gathered outside, some offering help, others just staring, their faces a mixture of fear and fascination. Kevin turned them all away. Just before dawn, when it seemed the boy's life was about to flicker out, his fever broke. His skin cooled, his breathing eased. He fell into a deep, natural sleep. Martha Callahan burst into sobs of relief, grabbing Amanda's hands. "Thank you," she cried. "Thank you. You saved him." Amanda, exhausted, simply nodded. The strength was his. I just helped him find it. But as morning light filled the small cabin, the whispers started outside. Some spoke of a miracle, but others muttered darker words. Witchcraft, savage rituals. "Ain't natural," Kevin heard one woman say. "Her knowing things a real doctor don't. She's dealing with dark powers." His jaw tightened. Before he could speak, Martha Callahan marched out onto her porch, her eyes red but fierce. "That woman," she declared, her voice ringing across the yard, "saved my son's life. When your own children are burning with fever, you remember that before you spread your poison and your fear." The crowd dispersed, but the damage was done. Amanda had shown her hand. She had revealed a power that the town could not understand, a power they would now fear. As they rode back up the mountain, the exhaustion hit Amanda like a physical blow. "You did a good thing," Kevin said quietly. "Did I?" she murmured. "My mother used to say helping others was always worth the risk, but not everyone sees a healing hand. Some only see a curse." Kevin had no answer. He knew she was right. They had won a small victory against death, but in doing so, they may have just lost the war for her place in this valley. A few days later, Kevin rode into town for supplies. "Be careful," Amanda warned him from the cabin doorway. "People fear what they don't understand." He found the town buzzing with talk of Tommy Callahan's miraculous recovery. But the talk was divided. In the general store, he heard Mrs. Peterson, the storekeeper's wife, whispering with a customer about Indian devilry. Outside the saloon, a group of miners argued. One praised Amanda's skill, but another spat tobacco juice and called her a witch. The town was a tinderbox, and Amanda was the spark. As Kevin secured the supplies to his mule, a man in a fine Eastern suit approached him. His boots were polished, his smile was smooth, but his eyes were as cold as a banker's heart. "Mr. Boone," the man said, "a moment of your time. My name is Harlow. I represent the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad Company." Kevin's hand instinctively went to the rifle on his back. "I've got no business with the railroad." "Perhaps not," Harlow said, his smile never wavering. "But you have business with a certain woman, one who holds a deed to some rather valuable property. That land contains the only reliable water source in this entire region, vital for our steam engines." He paused. "We are prepared to be quite generous to anyone who might facilitate our acquisition of that land." "Miss Greyhawk's business is her own," Kevin said, turning to leave. Harlow's voice turned hard. "Consider this carefully, Mr. Boone. That land will be acquired. One way or another. Progress has a way of crushing whatever stands in its path. It would be a tragedy if someone got hurt." Kevin swung into his saddle. "It might be a tragedy for anyone who tries to interfere with a legal property owner," he said, his voice low and dangerous. He rode away, feeling Harlow's cold eyes on his back. He told Amanda about the meeting that evening. She wasn't surprised. "The springs," she said, her shoulders tense. "My father always said they would be worth fighting for. Without that water, the railroad has to build 50 miles south through hostile territory. It would cost them a fortune. She looked at him, her green eyes blazing. My father died protecting that land. I will not sell. You won't have to, Kevin said. Whatever is coming, we'll face it together. As if on cue, thunder rolled in the distance. Dark storm clouds were gathering over the peaks. A storm's coming, Amanda said softly. Let it come, Kevin replied, his hand finding hers across the rough-hewn table. The storm that broke that night was a fury of wind and rain, but it was nothing compared to the storm of men that came with it. They came after midnight, their approach masked by the roar of the thunder. The first sign was the crack of a branch outside, too loud to be the wind. Kevin moved instantly, dousing the lantern, plunging the cabin into the flickering light of the hearth. Get down, he whispered, grabbing his Winchester. A rough voice shouted from the darkness. Greyhawk, come on out. Mr. Harlow is offering a fair price for that deed. Harlow's men, Amanda breathed, her hand on her knife. Go to hell, Kevin shouted back. Best ride on before you get hurt. The answer was a hail of rocks, shattering the cabin's only window. Wind and rain blasted into the room. Then, a flaming torch arced through the broken pane, landing on the floor. Amanda stomped it out, but another followed, then another. Kevin's rifle cracked, the sound deafening in the small space. A scream from the darkness told him he'd found his mark. That's your warning, he yelled. The next one goes center mass. But they were relentless. A torch landed on the small porch, the dry wood catching fire immediately. Smoke began to curl under the door. We have to put it out, Amanda said, grabbing a water bucket. They're waiting for us to show ourselves, Kevin said, firing 2 quick shots to drive the attackers back. Now! She darted out, throwing the water on the flames. A bullet whizzed past her head, close enough to feel its heat, and she scrambled back inside. They fought the fire together, a desperate dance of covering fire and buckets of water, the smoke stinging their eyes, the heat scorching their faces. Finally, the flames sputtered out. The attackers, having failed to burn them out, retreated into the stormy night. Dawn revealed the devastation. The cabin was scarred, the window was shattered, but it was still standing. They were still standing. We'll rebuild, Kevin said, his voice hoarse. He looked at her, his face smudged with soot, his eyes full of a new, raw emotion. My Sarah, my wife, he began, his voice catching. Fever took her. I thought my heart was buried with her, but watching you, your courage, your spirit, He couldn't finish, but Amanda understood. For the first time, she saw past the trapper, past the scarred mountain man, and saw the lonely, grieving husband beneath. Their moment was cut short. They both knew what they had to do. They had to go to town. They had to report the attack. It was a fatal mistake. They rode into Silver Creek, their faces grim. The townspeople stared at them, their expressions a mixture of fear and awe. They went straight to the sheriff's office. Weller listened to their story with a bored expression. Serious accusation, Boone. Got any proof? They demanded my father's deed, Amanda said. Weller ignored her. Interesting timing, you showing up, he said to Kevin. Got a report this morning. A fine bay stallion was stolen from the Maxwell Ranch last night. What's that got to do with us? Kevin demanded. Everything, Weller said, a slow, triumphant smile spreading across his face. He stood up. One of the men you shot last night. He was riding Maxwell's horse, and I have 2 witnesses who swear they saw you, Boone, up near the Maxwell place just last week, casing the joint. It was a lie, a perfectly constructed, inescapable lie. That's ridiculous, Amanda protested. He was with me all night. Like I said, Weller sneered, his eyes filled with contempt. The word of a half-breed savage ain't worth spit in a court of law. He pulled out a pair of iron handcuffs. Kevin Boone, you're under arrest for horse theft. In the Old West, horse theft was a hanging offense. Amanda watched in horror as they cuffed Kevin and dragged him to a cell. The heavy iron door slammed shut with a sound of absolute finality. "Get out," Weller snarled at her, "unless you want a cell of your own." She backed out into the street, alone. The town that had feared her now had a reason to hate her. She was the woman who had brought a horse thief, a potential killer, into their midst. She was utterly, completely alone. Her only ally was locked in a cell, facing a hangman's noose. Harlow and the railroad had won, or so they thought. They had underestimated the courage of one wild woman, and they had forgotten about the boy whose life she had saved. Amanda stumbled away from the jail, the weight of despair pressing down on her. She had nowhere to go. Kevin was gone, swallowed by a corrupt system. She was an outcast, a pariah. She ended up at the Callahan Ranch, the only place she could think of where she might not be met with a slammed door. Martha Callahan found her in the barn, numbly spreading hay for the horses. "You'll stay here tonight," Martha said, her voice firm. "It ain't safe for you out there." Later that night, huddled in the hayloft, Amanda prayed. She prayed in her father's Scots Gaelic and in her mother's Apache tongue, the languages of her two worlds blending into one desperate plea. A soft sound made her look up. Young Tommy Callahan stood in the doorway, his face serious in the lantern light. He walked toward her and held out a folded piece of paper. "Ma says to give you this," he whispered. "She says, don't give up." The note, written in a child's clumsy scrawl, contained only 3 words: "We believe you." That simple act of faith was a spark in her darkness. She rose the next morning with a new resolve. She would not hide. She would not run. She would face them. It was Sunday. The church bell was tolling, calling the good people of Silver Creek to worship. Amanda walked into town, her back straight, her father's deed clutched in her hand. She walked straight up the steps of the church and through the doors. The singing stopped. 100 faces turned to stare at her. Whispers rustled through the pews like dry leaves. She walked down the center aisle, right up to the pulpit, where Reverend Porter stood, his mouth agape. Before he could speak, she turned to face the congregation. She faced Sheriff Weller, sitting in the front pew like a self-righteous saint. She faced the storekeepers, the miners, the wives who had called her a witch. "Good people," she said, her voice clear and strong, ringing through the silent church. "I have come before you, and before God, with a truth that must be heard." She unfolded the deed. The crackle of the old paper was the only sound. She began to read, her voice steady, reciting the legal words her father had so carefully written. Then, she did something that shocked them all. She translated it, her voice shifting into the melodic, earthy tones of the Apache language, honoring her mother's people in this house of the white man's God. When she finished, she bowed her head. "God of my fathers," she prayed, her voice ringing with passion. "Defender of the fatherless, show your truth to those who would steal land and imprison the innocent. Let your light shine in this darkness." The silence that followed was absolute. Then, a chair scraped. Reverend Porter, his face pale and his hands trembling, rose to his feet. "I—" His voice cracked. He gripped the pulpit. "I must speak. God forgive my silence." He took a deep, shuddering breath. "I witnessed Thomas Greyhawk sign that deed. I saw him grant his land to his daughter, legal and proper. I have carried that knowledge like a stone in my heart, watching injustice be done and saying nothing out of fear." A collective gasp swept through the church. Sheriff Weller's face went white. "This woman speaks the truth." The preacher's voice grew stronger, filled with a new, righteous fire. "Her claim is righteous before God and man, and Kevin Boone is an innocent man, framed by those who would stop at nothing to get this land." The church erupted. The whispers turned to shouts. The shame on their faces turned to anger. They had been lied to. They had been manipulated. They turned as one to look at Sheriff Weller, their eyes filled with accusation. At that exact moment, the church doors burst open. A tall, silver-haired man in a dusty black coat stood there, his face grim. Behind him stood Martha Callahan. "Circuit Judge Morrison," the man announced, his voice booming through the chapel. "I received a telegraph. It seems we have some justice to dispense in Silver Creek." The arrival of the judge was like a bolt of lightning. Within the hour, the entire town was assembled outside the jail. Judge Morrison, with the preacher's sworn testimony in hand, conducted an impromptu hearing on the sheriff's desk. The two witnesses against Kevin broke down under the judge's sharp questioning, admitting they had been paid by Harlow to lie. The judge's face was like thunder. "Sheriff Weller," he said, his voice cracking like a whip, "you have abused your office, falsely imprisoned an innocent man, and conspired to steal land. Your badge." With a trembling hand, Weller unpinned the silver star. It clattered on the desk, the sound of his career ending. The judge ordered the cell door opened. Kevin stepped out into the sunlight, blinking. Amanda ran to him, and for the first time in front of the entire town, he wrapped her in his arms. The crowd cheered. "Miss Greyhawk," the judge said, his expression softening, "your deed is legally sound. I will register it officially myself, but be warned, the railroad will not give up easily." "We'll face them together," Kevin said, his arm tight around Amanda's shoulders. They rode back up to the mountains, the cheers of the townspeople following them. They found the cabin scarred but standing. As the sun set, casting long shadows across the valley, Kevin turned to her. "When I lost my wife," he said, his voice rough, "I thought I'd never feel anything again. But watching you, your courage, the way you heal instead of hate, Amanda Greyhawk, I love you." Tears streamed down Amanda's face. "People always called me wild," she whispered. "I never dreamed love could be given freely, without a price." "Love's meant to set us free," he said softly, "not put us in a cage." The next morning, they began to clear the damage. They hadn't been working for an hour when they heard the sound of wagons. It was half the town, led by Martha Callahan and Reverend Porter, their wagons loaded with lumber, tools, and food. "Thought you might need some help," Martha called out, a wide smile on her face. They worked together, the sounds of hammers and saws echoing through the valley. Men who had once jeered at Amanda now took instruction from her, her knowledge of her father's building techniques earning their respect. Women who had whispered about witchcraft now shared coffee and stories with her. Young Tommy Callahan, her staunchest defender, carefully planted a small pine sapling by the new porch steps. "For new beginnings," he said, but their peace was short-lived. A rider galloped up the trail, his face panicked. "It's Harlow!" he yelled. "He's telling everyone in the lower valley you're planning to sell the springs to a mining company. He's turning folks against you again." It was a new attack, not with fire and guns, but with lies, poisoning the well of their newfound community. That afternoon, another stranger arrived. This time, it was the stagecoach, lumbering up the mountain road. The driver handed Amanda a thick envelope, sealed with wax, bearing a postmark from Scotland. Puzzled, she opened it. Kevin read the letter aloud. It was from her father's family, the Greyhawks of Edinburgh. They had heard of her troubles. The letter stated in clear legal terms that her father had registered his American land claim with the family solicitors before he ever left Scotland. They had copies of all the documents. They stood ready to testify in any court. Her claim was backed not just by a territorial judge, but by international law. Her father, even from across the grave, had protected her. He had left her a family she never knew she had. That evening, Harlow rode up to the half-rebuilt cabin, a smug look on his face. "I'm here to make one final offer," he said, pulling out a thick wallet. $5,000 in cash. Sign over the deed tonight and you can disappear." It was a fortune. more money than she had ever dreamed of. But Amanda looked at the new timbers of her home, at the small pine sapling taking root, at the man standing beside her. She held up the letter from Scotland. "This land was bought with faith and blood," she said, her voice clear as a bell. "It is not for sale." Harlow's face twisted in rage. "You'll regret this. I control the banks, the supply lines. I will starve you out." He galloped away, spitting threats into the wind. But his threats were empty now. The next week, wagons from the lower valley began arriving, bringing supplies and offers of help. The townspeople, led by Reverend Porter, had ridden down and told them the truth. Harlow's lies had been exposed. Spring arrived, melting the snow and turning the valley green. The railroad, faced with a federal injunction and international legal trouble, rerouted their line 50 miles to the south, just as Amanda's father had known they would have to. One sunny afternoon, the whole valley gathered in the small mountain chapel. Amanda, in a simple white dress sewn by the women of the town, walked down the aisle. Kevin waited for her, his face glowing with a love so powerful it filled the entire room. They were married by Reverend Porter, their vows witnessed by the very community that had once tried to cast her out. As the years passed, their cabin became the heart of the valley. Amanda's herb garden flourished, and she became the unofficial healer for the entire region, her wisdom sought by all. Kevin taught the local children to read and write, using his old, worn Bible as their first textbook. Tommy's pine tree grew tall and strong, a living monument to a community that had learned to choose compassion over fear. One evening, as the sun set, they sat on their porch, watching the last light fade from the peaks. The valley was peaceful, the only sounds the whisper of the wind and the distant lowing of cattle. Amanda leaned her head on Kevin's shoulder. "They called me too wild," she said softly. Kevin put his arm around her, his touch gentle and sure. "But wild is what the Lord uses to heal what's broken," he whispered. "And love is what he uses to make it whole." The lamplight from their cabin spilled out into the darkness, a beacon of hope in the vast, wild mountains. A home built not just of logs and stone, but of courage, justice, and a love that had proven strong enough to tame a valley and set a wild heart free. Thank you for listening. Stories have a way of finding us when we need them most. If this story found you today, don't forget to subscribe. I share a new one every day, and I'll be waiting for you right here for the next one.